Hello and welcome to This is the Way, a podcast sponsored by the Hong Kong Ethics Lab of the University of Hong Kong. My name is Richard Kim.
I'm Justin Tewald. For our Chinese-speaking audience, 欢迎收听道可道中国哲学播客. All right, so if you're listening to these episodes in order, and I know not everyone is, but those who do will probably recall that our most recent episode was about impartial caring, which is our translation of jian'ai. And impartial caring is one of the core doctrines of the school of thought that we call Mohism. The rough idea behind impartial caring, in case you didn't hear that one, is just that at least for certain ethical purposes, you should care about and care for everyone in roughly the same way, regardless of your relationship to them. So as opposed to this kind of more natural or more popular view that you should care more for those who are near and dear to you, like family members and so on, close friends, community members, there's in some sense, in a sense that's not entirely clear because it's for debate among interpreters nowadays, basically the Mohists seem to suggest that you should care for everyone regardless of your relationship to them. In some way there's a kind of a parity is supposed to be between the care that you have for the near and dear and for the total strangers. So that was the topic of the last episode, just broadly described. But more specifically, we looked at two arguments for Mohist impartial caring, two Mohist arguments for impartial caring. One was the caretaker argument, the other was the filial piety argument. Now what we're going to do is turn the tables. And we decided to just plunge in and give the Confucians a chance to respond. So what we're going to do is look at Confucian arguments or rejoinders to the Mohist views. Specifically, we're going to look at two arguments offered by the Confucian thinker Mencius, or Mengzi, who both disagreed with Mohists and sometimes got into debates with Mohist philosophers, as we'll see, actually, in one of today's passages.
So, Justin, this topic of partiality and impartiality and this debate between the Mohists and Confucians, this topic is one of those philosophical topics that are also quite, I think, rooted in everyday concern. And one way that this topic relates to my own sort of personal experience is that when I was an undergrad, and I think I was a freshman when I read this paper by Peter Singer. It's called Famine, Affluence, and Morality.
Yes.
It's a very famous paper.
Well
worth reading. We'll definitely put into show notes because it's very clear and it gets at some like a idea that's really important and a bit disturbing too, as well as I found when I was 18 all those years ago, which is that we should have this impartial concern for all strangers who are, starving to death, who are suffering from famine.
Yes.
And he gives a very powerful and, as I remember, a very compelling argument. And I remember being very struck and moved by that argument. And actually, one thing that happened was I remember right after reading that paper, starting to collect money to send to like a food, one of those charity services, famine relief programs. And I think we gathered like a couple $100. But of course, one thing that happens is, you kind of motivated for a while, but, eventually motivation kind of gives out. That's an interesting issue in its own right. But I was definitely moved by that argument. I was wondering, Justin, if, you've thought a long time about this debate in particular between the Confucians and the Mohists and have thought a lot about partiality and impartiality and have even written on it. Has your philosophical reflections on this issue, has it sort of connected with, I don't know, reshaping your actual beliefs about this?
Yeah, definitely. It's funny you mentioned the Peter Singer case. So Peter Singer, as Richard mentioned, he wrote this very influential article. It's influential in part because everyone likes to respond to it. As soon as you hear the argument, listeners, you will probably want to respond to it because otherwise it seems like you're on the hook for giving away almost all of your disposable income. So basically the way the argument works is there's no reason to regard a famine victim in a faraway country as any more or less your responsibility, their well-being, their life, more or less your responsibility than anyone else. And so Peter Singer asks us to imagine a child who's drowning and, we could potentially save the child at the cost of ruining our nice clothes that we have to be wearing when we see it. He says that's more or less the position that we find ourselves in with respect to famine victims. Most of us could easily afford to lose some of our disposable income in order to save lives far away. And so the upshot is that if, you really understand your moral duties in the strictest sense or something, you should be giving away all of your income basically up to the point where you have no disposable income left or you just barely have enough to kind of get by. Anyway, so it's a powerful argument. It bothers a lot of people. And yeah, it's I guess one nice thing about the Confucians is that if you buy their view, their kind of conception of how care or obligations to promote people's welfare are to be distributed, then it turns out you don't have to sacrifice so much for the sake of famine victims far away. Because Confucians recommend this thing called graded love or care with distinctions, where you have the strongest obligations to those near and dear to you and slightly weaker ones to others, depending on how far removed they are from your sort of most personal relationships in life. So, yeah, it just so happens that, so when I was fifth grade, so I guess I would have been 10 or 11, that was one of the years of the big Ethiopia famine. There were like a few years in a row where Ethiopia suffered from famine. And at our school, my elementary school, we had a kind of competition, a fundraising competition for famine relief. And each class, they're given opportunities to donate, and then they sort of ranked the classes according to who donated the most. And our class won hands down, decidedly. Our class won over the others. And it was because I actually came to a view pretty similar to Peter Singer's. I didn't have the language to describe it in exactly this way, but basically what I decided was that citizenship was morally arbitrary. So I was, struck by this idea that well, we think that for almost all purposes, really, ethnicity, race, gender, whether someone happens to be, vegetarian or to like dogs or cats or whatever, all those things are just contingent facts about people. They're morally arbitrary facts. They don't affect their status as human beings and what we owe them, And so I thought, well, why isn't that true of citizenship too? So I kind of thought, actually, I do have an obligation to give away all my disposable income. So I gave away, multiple weeks of my allowance, which ended up decidedly putting our class in the lead in terms of fundraising. And yeah, I don't remember, to be honest, how long I stuck with it, but I was struck by that idea at a young age. And I even remember, I'm sort of embarrassed to admit it now, but I was kind of a knee-jerk utilitarian when I took my first intro to philosophy class, in part because of my cosmopolitan intuitions or presuppositions. When I describe myself as someone who is willing to donate a lot for non-citizens, for people in faraway countries, I'm basically saying I was a kind of cosmopolitan, radical cosmopolitan. And yeah, no, I'm no longer that. And I think actually the Confucians have convinced me. Yeah, I think this is one of those cases where I can say that my study of the philosophical texts, the debates, my thinking about the arguments has reshaped my views. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. So this is where philosophy can really influence real human practice and our mode of thinking. Yeah, that's a really great story. And yeah, no, you're right. Like I remember that image of, if you came across a child drowning and you weren't willing to get your pants wet because it would cost $20 to clean them up. I mean, I would have thought you could be maybe even rightly be accused of, not quite, I guess not murdering, but certainly responsible for a child's death in some substantial way.
Yeah, culpable negligence.
Yeah,
right.
and it'd be extraordinarily callous and cruel. And so, and the only difference here is that the distance, right? Like you don't see the child right now. Then why is that relevant is what Singer argues. So yeah, I was struck by that argument in exactly that way too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I was struck by the same idea once, but my view now is that distance does matter. It matters for virtue. That's one way of accounting for it. It matters for relationships and so on. So, I mean, I have to admit, I still admire people who have this kind of conviction that they have this deep obligation to save many lives. I mean, I don't regret that you, Richard, or that I donated lots of money to famine relief. But I still actually think that, yes, at the end of the day, if you want to be a good person, if you want to adopt a moral worldview that you can be truly at home with and adopt wholeheartedly, it's got to be one that makes these distinctions between the near and dear and those that you don't actually know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the idea might be here that, certainly it's good to do, right? To donate more of your money when you can. It's what classically people would say is an act of charity, but not an act of justice. It's what philosophers sometimes call supererogatory. So an action that is good, but not morally required. Whereas for a Singer, these actions are just morally required. And really, blood is on your hands if you do not step in or donate all your wealth to that degree where you basically are just meeting your basic needs. And that does strike, I think, most people as implausible, or I don't know. But at that time when I was 18, I don't know, you probably had this thought too, Justin. I thought, but we're just rationalizing, right? Like it's just
Yes.
hard, it's just too difficult to really live according to this principle. And so
Yeah.
maybe we're just disposed to not accept it or think it's implausible, even though maybe from a moral perspective. And I think this is what Peter Singer thinks from
Yeah.
a purely moral point of view. This is a just sound argument. But, human beings being flawed as we are, we just can't quite live up to the standard.
Anyway, so this is all right on topic, as it turns out, because although the ancient philosophers didn't talk about famine relief, that wasn't exactly the sort of issue that they had to deal with in their day. They were thinking about these rather challenging cases where it seemed like to adopt impartial caring would have extremely demanding implications for individual moral agents, that if you're really serious about impartial caring, then you should have to give up a great deal of your well-being, your interests, even your family's interests, for the sake of that ideal. And so that's going to be at the heart, really, of some of the discussion that we're going to look at shortly.
Yep. So I'm excited to discuss this more, and we will do so right after the break.
Yeah, great. Okay, we're back, and today's topic is Confucian criticisms of the Mohist doctrine of jian'ai, which we're translating as impartial caring. More specifically, Mencius's criticisms of the doctrine of jian'ai. Of the classical Confucian philosophers, Mencius is the one who's most adamant about Mohism in general being wrong-headed, and jian'ai in particular, impartial caring, being wrong-headed. And we're going to look at two arguments in particular. Let me make sure I get them in the right order. The first we're going to call the without a father argument, basically just quoting directly from a key line in the passage. And then the other we're calling the two sources or two roots passage.
All right. So to give you a sense of what impartial caring or jian'ai is all about, it's roughly the view that you owe everyone care and concern no matter their relationship to you. So, for example, you should care about someone's hunger or suffering, even if that person is not, let's say, your sibling or mother or friend. And we've discussed this in the last episode on Mohism, but there's stronger and weaker views of this doctrine. So, for example, one of the weaker interpretations comes from Chris Fraser, which is the idea that, according to Chris, jian'ai or impartial caring is really just about owing a kind of minimal consideration to everyone that you interact with, whether or not they're related to you. So he doesn't think that it requires, even for the Mohist, equal consideration. So it's weaker because as long as you have some consideration of the interest or well-being of someone else, that's enough to have impartial concern. You don't need equal concern for both your parents and total strangers. So, and there's different arguments that, of course, Chris gives. And of course, there's also much stronger interpretations, which many scholars also hold, which is that you should care about, according to the Mohist, you should care about everyone equally and count all of their interests or well-being equally. So this is obviously a much stronger view of this doctrine.
Yeah, that's right. So there's a lot of vexing difficulties, interpretive difficulties here. What's interesting about the Mohist is it's pretty clear that they're still imagining people living in family situations. A lot of their arguments assume that there's still people who are biologically related to each other living under the same roof, and presumably they still have recognizably family-like relationships. So it can't be that they're all just running around trying as much as possible to share all of the fruits of their labor equally with everyone, So that's one incentive among many to try to take seriously this idea that you can be a Mohist and practice impartial care while still playing favorites with your own family members in the ways that people thought were sort of common sense and familiar at the time. That said, there are some good arguments for this view that in some sense that truly is controversial and demanding. If you're a Mohist, you're supposed to be practicing impartial caring in some ways that are demanding of people, that really do go against the grain of nature and feel very challenging to people. Anyway, I think we'll have a chance to talk about it. I'm tempted to say, Richard, that for purposes of today's discussion, maybe it doesn't matter so much what the Mohists themselves thought, but what Mencius thought about the Mohists, right? How did Mencius understand the Mohist doctrine of impartial caring? And it's pretty clear that in the context of the Mencius, they're basically distinguishing between care that comes with distinctions and care that comes without distinctions. So in one of the passages that we'll look at, the Mohist interlocutor, the Mohist that he's debating with, says, ultimately, in some sense, we should be aiming for a kind of care that has no distinctions, meaning we care for everyone to the same degree, whether they're total strangers or family members or close friends or what have you. And that's certainly a strong interpretation. What it entails in terms of like how we live our daily lives isn't entirely clear, but I think it's already quite controversial, right? Even if like I want to endorse the view intellectually that everyone, whether they're a stranger or a friend or a family member, makes the same ultimate claim on me, that their interests, their well-being ultimately should weigh or count equally. That's controversial because there will be some situations where I'm powerfully tempted to prioritize the interests of my own family members and close friends and people in my community and so on.
Mm-hmm.
Just as an aside here, one of the problems I think that comes up oftentimes when debating Confucian and Mohist views about impartial caring is that it's very easy to, when talking about Mohist impartial caring, to conflate it with or quickly kind of retreat to what I think, what we in 21st century philosophy call consequentialism, to think of the Mohist doctrine as essentially consequentialism. And consequentialism is this, sorry for the technical term, it refers to a view in normative ethics according to which the right action is the one that always maximizes some good across the population. And the Mohists are quite clear about, they often make consequentialist justifications for their ethical views, and they're pretty clear about what the good is that should be maximized. And that's what they call benefit or li. And it seems pretty tempting to say that Mohist consequentialists, like most consequentialists, not all, but most consequentialists nowadays, understand that good in what philosophers call an agent-neutral sense, meaning the good matters independently of your relationship to the person that you're trying to benefit. It doesn't matter whether they're a sister, brother, parent, child, or what have you. And so if that's the Mohist view, then it seems like it's tempting to just say what they call impartial caring just is the consequentialist premises from which they argue again and again. And I sometimes think that one of the reasons there's so much confusion about Mohist impartial caring is precisely because it's not obvious what consequentialism as such requires of us in our day-to-day life. You can use consequentialist justifications or arguments or ways of reasoning to convince people that they should actually be very loyal to their family. We could argue that societies are better off, on the whole, where in situations where they have these close family units where people learn to love and care for each other, where they're acting on behalf of people that they know well rather than total strangers and so on. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I can see how over time, for example, among Mohist thinkers, it might not have been entirely clear if you start from consequentialist premises, what that entails for our sort of attitudes towards strangers, for example.
Right. You might have a rule consequentialist view where some of the rules have to do with partiality. So like, take care of your family first, something like that. And that will lead to the greatest consequences for all, over the long run. So yeah, you can have consequentialism and still have it's logically compatible with either of the stronger or weaker impartial care view that we just talked about. I think they are logically distinct.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So setting that aside, we'll just say that there is some doctrine out there that both Mencius and at least the Mohists that are reported in the text of the Mencius seem to endorse, according to which, in some sense of this word care, you're supposed to care for everyone equally, regardless of their relationship to you. And maybe we can revisit this topic again once we've looked at the arguments.
Yeah. All right. So maybe we should turn to our first passage at this point, which, Justin, you labeled as without a father passage. So this comes from the Mengzi 3b9, and we're going to use Brian Van Noorden's translation, and it's pretty short. So I think I'll just read this one. It goes as follows. The doctrines of Yangzhu and Mozi fill the world. If a doctrine does not lean toward Yangzhu, then it leans toward Mozi. Yangzhu is for oneself. This is to not have a ruler. Mozi is impartial caring. This is to not have a father. To not have a father and to not have a ruler is to be an animal.
Yeah. I find that generally speaking, as philosophical schools of thought evolve, they start defining themselves over and against one another. So, in the early days when a system of thought is being first formulated, a philosopher might make a passing comment and it may not be central. It may not be a view that they're a core commitment necessarily in the school of thought. But over time, because it becomes a point of debate or dispute between multiple schools of thought, they start investing more heavily in defending that view. And it does become central, it does become a core commitment. So anyway, yeah, I think that by the time we get to Mencius in the history of classical Chinese philosophy, we're pretty well developed competing schools of thought. And we can see evidence for that in the fact that Mencius is always defining his views over and against other schools of thought. And among those that he's defining his views against, the two that figure most prominently by far are the Yangists. That's just a kind of ist or ism phrase that it is applied to this ancient philosopher Yang, Y-A-N-G, and then Z-H-U. That's one school of thought he's resisting. And the other, of course, are the Mohists, the school of thought associated with Mozi, M-O-Z-I. So Yang, as he seems to understand it, he says the Yang view is essentially for oneself. So on most interpretations, Mencius takes the Yangists to be proponents of ethical egoism, that you should do what's in your own best interest. And then Mohism, on some understanding of the range of possibilities, kind of goes to the other extreme. Mohism is all about impartial caring, jian'ai. And so then we have very quick arguments against both of these views. He says, if you adopt the kind of Yangist view, the ethical egoism or normative egoism, then in a sense, you don't have a ruler, right? Maybe that just stands in for this idea that you don't really belong to a political society as we would normally understand it, right? One of the most influential commentators in history on Chinese Confucian texts is Zhu Xi. Zhu Xi explains it as follows. He says, if you're a Yangist, well, then you're an egoist. And if you're an egoist, then you don't believe that there are any norms of right and wrong that you should have to apply yourself to beyond yourself, you know? So how could you ever sort of ask someone to sacrifice for a cause higher than oneself if you're a Yangist? And under those circumstances, it's hard to imagine a political society, you know, a sort of one that hangs together in any meaningful sense. So that's the quick argument against Yangism. The quick argument against Mohism is that if you practice impartial caring or if you adopt impartial caring, then you don't have a father. And that's obviously meant to stand in for all kinds of special relationships where you are close to someone, where you have some intimate connection to them, and thus they have some sort of priority or privilege in your life, you know? They matter more than someone else. And so then the passage goes on to say, what's so wrong with all these things? Not having a ruler, not having a father? Well, if you don't have a ruler, if you don't have a father, you're an animal. All right, so let's take this argument that if you practice impartial caring, you don't have a father, and see if we can understand it sort of a little bit more precisely. So I've noticed when I teach this passage that sometimes I don't manage to get my interpretation across because the students and I are understanding the argument in slightly different ways. And I sometimes notice actually some tensions in the traditional commentaries between two different ways of understanding the passage. So let me just suggest that there are two ways of understanding the claim that by practicing impartial caring, you're without a father, without special family relationships. One I want to call the lifestyle interpretation, and the other I want to call the attitude interpretation. I'm not sure about those terms. Maybe we can revise them once I've talked about them a little bit. So the lifestyle interpretation goes like this. It says, when you're trying to reconstruct in your own head Mengzi's or Mencius's argument, you're imagining that he's saying, well, listen, if you adopt impartial caring, then as a consequence, in terms of your behavior, in terms of the lifestyle that you live, you're going to behave towards your father and other family members as if he's not really a father, or as if they're not really your family members, right? So like whatever it is that you would normally expect people to do with their fathers, you know, probably most people are more obedient to their parents. They take their parents' advice and demands more seriously. They care about them more. They'll go to greater lengths to protect them, to nurture them, to help them. All those things are kind of lifestyle implications of having a father. They're kind of constitutive of what it means to live as in a father-child relationship with someone, right? So one interpretation is that he's saying, listen, if you adopt impartial caring, then you can't consistently with this doctrine, you know, behave towards your father as a father, right? That's the lifestyle interpretation. But the other I want to call the attitude interpretation. And that just says that actually, when he's concerned about losing your father or sort of living without a father, it's not just that he's worried about how you'll behave toward your father, but the attitudes you have toward your father. There's some sense in which, like, even if you do live under the same roof with a particular person that happens to be your biological parent, you know, even if you are extra nice to them and so on, if your attitude toward the father is in some sense weak, or, you know, if you don't see your father as having some special privileged status in your life, then in a sense, no matter how you behave towards him, you're still not really treating him or regarding him as a father. See if I can sort of motivate that interpretation a little bit more. So maybe this sounds really wild, but like imagine you, listener, that you have this, like partner, this spouse, maybe just like a boyfriend or girlfriend. Well, we'll say a spouse, okay? And he's been like reading, I don't know, some radical literature on like free love or sharing love or something. And so he decides that although he's married to you and although he's your husband, he feels like he has a lot of love to share. And so he's like joined up with this group where he's going to be married not just to you, but to like, I don't know, 300 other people or something, And you're very upset because you're his spouse and you think, oh no, I thought we had this great partnership going and now you've ruined it. Like it's over, And he says, no, it's not over. We're still married. I want us to continue to be married. It's just that I want to be married to all these other people too, right? And why? Well, because I have a lot of love to share, right? Now, I don't know what your reaction will be, but my reaction is going to be like, well, good for you. But from my point of view, we're no longer in a spousal relationship. We're no longer in a kind of romantic partnership, because part of what it means to be in this special romantic partnership is that in your eyes, I have a very privileged and important status. My interests come before most other people's interests in most respects. And if I have to share that sort of status with like 300 other people, my interests or my well-being, my concerns no longer rise to the level of being those of a spouse to you, right? I feel like there's something like this going on all the time when we talk about relationships. So sometimes you hear people on the street, or if you think back on these arguments you've had in the past with friends about whether someone, we'll call him Sam or something, really is a good friend of yours. People will have these discussions. They'll say, well, he seems like a good friend. He does a lot of the nice things, but I always get the sense that it's just instrumental, that he's trying to make friends with me because he sees me as someone who can help him, I don't know, get a better job, right? Because it makes him cool to have lots of friends or what have you. And if you feel like you've been instrumentalized in some way, then even if Sam is in most respects behaving towards you as you would expect someone behaves toward their friend, you might say he doesn't actually qualify as a friend. You see, that's the attitude interpretation. It says that it's a necessary feature of being in a special relationship with someone that you have the right attitude and not just that you behave toward them in a certain way. So I know I'm getting long-winded here, but like, here's my interpretation. I think that when people read this passage, especially in the context of the full passage, Mencius goes on to talk about all the chaos that is inflicted on society when people don't have a father and don't have a ruler. They're tempted to read it merely as this kind of empirical claim about what happens when you adopt Mohist impartial caring and youngest egoism to families and societies, But I actually think there's another way of reading the passage according to which he doesn't just think the force of the argument to be without a father depends upon this worry about the chaos of life without families. He doesn't think it's just the lifestyle consequences that should bother us. It's also the fact that we're depriving ourselves of this really important, meaningful relationship. There's really important value in a whole and complete life, anyway, in having these special relationships where you kind of go into the world knowing that there are all these people who care about you, not quite unconditionally, but almost unconditionally, who have this kind of love and care for you that is profoundly resilient, so that come what may, no matter how tough the times are you find yourself in, you know that there are these people on your side, like your parents and your children and your spouse and so on. And if you think that is like an important, fundamental, and basic good in life, then maybe it's the case that Mohism in general and Mohist impartial caring in particular isn't compatible with that. That you're, in a way, if you're a true practicing Mohist, you're just not going to have those special relationships. You won't have the right sort of unconditional love or concern or care for other people in your life.
Yeah, I really like this distinction a lot. And yeah, this attitude interpretation is really intriguing. It does suggest that like being a father isn't just a biological relation. There's a kind of important substantive role involved. And there's a certain normative significance. There's certain also like normative requirements of what it is to be a son or a father. Yeah.
Sometimes in philosophy, we say that it's a success concept. It doesn't just come to you automatically. You have to kind of live up to some standards in order for it to apply,
Yeah, it's a very much richer notion here. Incredibly important special relationship. And so, yeah, the attitude that you would have if you adopt impartial care would undermine an important necessary condition for what it is to have a father or to have a father in this sense, at least, with this normative significance built in. That's actually a really interesting idea.
Yeah. I admit it's controversial because the more natural temptation when you read the passage as a whole is to read it as complaining about the lifestyle implications of Mohism. You know, we didn't read the whole passage because it's long, but if you keep going, you'll see that he kind of describes how people practicing impartial caring, or the other view, the youngest egoism, will live as animals, and they'll come to the point where, you know, society is so chaotic that people can't organize against wild animals, and wild animals are eating them, and maybe even cannibalism as results. So people kind of tend to read this passage as suggesting that there are a series of consequences for the dissolution of society, you know, dissolution of civilization as we know it or something. But I think that the more natural way of understanding these concepts of special relationships in general, fatherhood, childhood, siblinghood, friendship, and so on, actually presupposes that both an attitude and certain behavioral implications are necessary in order to instantiate a particular relationship. So again, if you go back to those debates you have sometimes thinking about whether Sam is a true friend to you or not, you know, probably if you're talking about looking back at Sam's behavior toward you, you'll be looking both at how he behaves toward you, like does he do the nice things that friends do? That time that you went to go visit him, you flew into town, and I don't know, like the hotel you're planning to stay at, it turns out they didn't get your reservation, so you had nowhere to stay. Did he like offer to let you stay at his place, or was he just kind of callous and indifferent to your plight? So those are the sorts of behavioral questions you're asking about Sam. But then you're also going to want to know, does Sam basically just see me as like a stepping stone to his next great career, or as someone whose approval makes him cooler? You know, I also want to know whether Sam is, actually sort of cares about my interests in their own right, independently of how they advance his. So I think both the right attitude and the right behaviors are necessary to instantiate the relationship. I think that's just how relationship terms work in natural language. You know, when people, no matter what language they're speaking, they talk about family members or friends or what have you. And so for that reason, I think that when Mencius says, by practicing impartial caring, you're without a father, he probably means it in both senses. Despite having made a really cut and dry distinction earlier, I think he probably has both senses of fatherhood or parenthood in mind. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. So what about this idea about being an animal that we find at the end of the passage? I find that to be intriguing. In other parts of the Mencius, we find Mencius appealing to the importance of being human, right? So in 2a6, when he talks about the moral sprouts,
Yes.
Those without these specific feelings of, let's say, compassion when seeing a child about to fall into a well and suffer. If you don't feel some alarm and compassion, then you're not human. And we've discussed this in the past, and it seems to carry some kind of normative weight or significance to appeal to one's human status. And so here, being an animal in contrast, or a beast on another translation, seems to suggest that there's something wrong with you. There's something defective about you.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's interesting. So it seems like Mencius is invoking this idea that it's wrong to be without a father, because by being without a father, you will be an animal, you'll be a beast, you'll be qing shou. And so then you might ask, well, what's so wrong with that? What's wrong with being an animal? What's wrong with being not human, less than human? And here I think we have actually multiple options. I'm not sure we have to choose between them. Maybe we can just take them all on board. So one is, it could just be that Mencius has this view that we find in lots of the ancient traditions. We find it in Aristotle. We find it in a lot of medieval ways of justifying people's ethical views. We find it even in kind of like a lot of moral discourse today. One of the things that you ought to do is sort of live according to the standards set by your species. So there's something wrong fundamentally with being inhuman or non-human, behaving in ways that somehow fundamentally go against your humanity. So for what it's worth, this later Confucian philosopher that I really like, who's very careful about his arguments and concepts, Dai Zhen, that's D-A-I, that's his family name, and then personal name is Zhen, C-H-E-N. He understands Mencius in exactly that way. He thinks that all human beings have a close enough resemblance to each other that they count as belonging to the same natural kind, or lei. And once you belong to a certain natural kind, that sets certain ethical standards that you can live up to or fall short of, which should matter for you for lots of ethical purposes. So yeah, that's kind of a way of saying just intrinsically, it's wrong to be less than human or to be an animal. But there are other ways of interpreting this argument according to which, like, being less than human or being an animal is problematic for other reasons. Like, if you go back to the passage that you mentioned, Richard, 2a6, that's the famous passage in the Mengzi or the Mencius, where he says, if you see a child about to fall into a well, you will have, if you're at all a human being, all humane and human, you will have a sense of alarm and compassion. And you'll have at least some part of you that wants the child not to fall into the well. And then he goes on to say, and so from this, we can conclude that your sprout of benevolence, that compassionate response that you have, which is your sprout of benevolence, is just as much a part of you as like the four limbs are a part of your body, right? Mm-hmm. He says it also shows that these sprouts aren't welded to you externally, but are kind of a well-integrated part of your moral psychology. And so it could be that what he's trying to suggest is that if you act in ways that aren't human, you're just going to find lots of internal resistance in the same way that you would if you like tried to somehow, I don't know, attach a new appendage to yourself and make use of it. It just wouldn't be well integrated. You couldn't manipulate it easily. You would kind of forget its presence all the time and be bumping into things. And so by analogy, you would have these sort of moral commitments that wouldn't be well integrated into the rest of your psychology. You'd forget about them often. They wouldn't work harmoniously and naturally with your desires and feelings and so on.
Yeah, this seems to get at like a broader point of Mencius that comes back over and over throughout the text, I think, which is he does seem to care a lot about the natural, or the way that we have basic inclinations and natural tendencies. And he does seem to think, as you just pointed out, Justin, that we have to pay careful attention to all that, because over the long run, we can't really adopt certain practices or actions or character traits that just goes against our natural grain, because over time it's going to conflict with some other fundamental parts of us. And so it will be kind of unlivable. And so I think that's why he wants to sort of offer this picture of us as kind of moral in an organic way. It's not something that's just kind of, right, as you put it, like artificially imposed from the outside, like, or manufactured from the outside. And of course, that'll lead us to also our next passage, because the next passage really deals directly with some of these topics.
Yeah, that's right. So this whole presupposition that in some sense you should be living by standards that come naturally to you as a human being, that might come up again in this next passage, which we're calling the two roots or two sources passage. Mm-hmm. All right, so this passage is 3a5, the two roots, two sources passage. And let me set it up a little bit, if that's all right, before we read it. So in this passage, I think Mencius is engaged in a kind of, what's the word? I guess proxy debate. This often happens in the classical text where two interlocutors don't actually debate with each other in person, but they have someone, oftentimes a student or multiple students, serving as go-betweens or as intermediaries who go back and forth between the two parties. And they'll say, this other guy said this about your views. And then the master responds and the student just conveys that counter argument to the debating partner and so on. And so it kind of goes back and forth through these intermediaries. It doesn't happen very often these days because we have so many convenient modes of communication. But I will say it happens to me in Hong Kong sometimes, because one of the beautiful things about Hong Kong, if you're a specialist in Chinese philosophy, is that Hong Kong is full of universities. It's full of tertiary institutions of higher education, where the universities have other specialists in Chinese philosophy. And the graduate students all sit in on the classes of the other specialists in Chinese philosophy. So I get students from Chinese University in Lingnan sitting in my classes, and my graduate students go out to Chinese University of Hong Kong and Lingnan and Hong Kong Baptist and so on, and sit in on the classes of my colleagues. And so I oftentimes find out through my students what the other specialists are saying about me and my work, especially when they assign my articles or books. So it still happens in the present day. It just, it's not the sort of like paradigm case of a debate, as it seems to be. At least it's a more common way of debating in ancient times. Okay, so that's what's going on, is that there's this proxy debate, as I'm calling it, a debate through an intermediary between Mencius and a rival interlocutor, another party. And that other party is Yi Zhi. Yi is the family name. Remember, in Chinese, the family name goes first. And Zhi, Zhi, is the personal name. So he was, according to the text, a Mohist So he's someone who identifies with Mohism. Presumably he endorses Mohist views. He also practices the Mohist way of life. So it's basically a debate between Mencius and a Mohist. And you might think, well, that then makes it relatively cut and dry, which side each thinker should be on with respect to any one Mohist or Confucian doctrine. But it's not actually so cut and dry in this case. This is why this passage is so interesting. It seems like his interlocutor is willing to soft pedal or moderate his impartial caring doctrine and practice a little bit. It's one of the reasons people have been so fascinated with this. He recognizes that impartial caring is so demanding that you can't realistically expect it of everyone. And so he has this kind of more realistic, more moderate version of the doctrine, at least as most people seem to understand the passage. And so here's how it goes. It seems like this is what he thinks. He thinks that impartial caring describes the correct ideal, the right ideal. This is the goal that we should strive to achieve. We should strive to become the sorts of people who can care about everyone in some sense without recognition of any degrees of difference, degrees of intensity or what have you, degrees of burden or obligation, regardless of their relationship to us. It's a kind of universalism that we should all aspire to. But he also knows this. A, it's unrealistic that everyone would be able to do it. And B, if you want to care about other people, you have to start with your family. The family is where you learn to care about other people. You learn to love, in some sense, in the context of this sort of household of biologically related people who live under the same roof and know each other intimately. So the view that he comes to, this more moderate view, is essentially that you begin to learn to care for others in the family, but then you still strive as much as possible to achieve this ideal of impartial caring. So over time, presumably, you learn to care about a larger scope of people and you care about them more impartially. So that's the more moderate view. This comes up because his interlocutor, Yi Zhi, this rival Mohist thinker, is basically not being a good Mohist with respect to his parents. So his parents have passed away, they've died, and he's buried them. Now, if you're a Mohist in this time, it's well known that Mohists believe in what we'll call frugal funerals. So they don't believe that you should waste lots of resources on a funeral. And that's because they're good, sort of tough-minded, practical thinkers. They realize that a lot of resources are wasted on this sort of thing. Rather than burying your parents in many, many coffins with lots of layers of clothing and some of the finest stuff that they prized when in their lifetime, you should repurpose a lot of those material goods. So you should have a relatively modest funeral. You should give them a little bit of clothing, a modest coffin. It shouldn't be lavish. It shouldn't be ornate. It shouldn't be expensive. Those resources would be better spent, feeding people and helping people and so on. So it seems to follow from Mohist impartial caring, or at the very least, Mohist consequentialism, that you should be frugal in mourning your parents. But if you put yourself in the shoes of a Mohist in that era, you could probably understand why many Mohists would be reluctant to do it. Imagine that everyone else in your community mourns their parents in this more extravagant way. They spend lots of resources, they spend 3 years mourning them, and here you are, in order to live up to your standards and expectations, you're expected to just, mourn them for a day and then go back to work, and throw them in a box. Yeah, right. You'd be really kind of ashamed, I think. Like, you'd be like, well, if everyone else is doing this and that's how they show their love for their parents, everyone's going to think I don't love my parents. And you wouldn't want that, So Yi Zhi just caves. He doesn't have the sort of strength of will to mourn the parents in the frugal way that is expected of Mohists. And so
can I quickly interject with just one quick point? Because the world's most famous utilitarian is, of course, Peter Singer, professor at Princeton University. And, he's actually, by many standards, a great person. He donates like a lot of his income. I heard like over half. So it's, very admirable, way more than what most people can do. But he does think, right, we owe quite a bit. We should give away a lot of our wealth. But he was somehow, some people found out that he sent his, I think, elderly mother, this was some years ago, to a really expensive retirement community, like the best in New York City. And it was like really expensive, like over 100,000. And so some people were like calling him out and, and saying like, doesn't this violate your, your own moral doctrine? And I'm not sure what he exactly said in response. I mean, to be honest, I suspect, he's a human being and, he loves his mom and wants to take care of her. And
Yes.
it's extremely natural. And, but it just seems like there's a kind of a modern corollary here with, certain modern utilitarians also.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good example. So nowadays, people don't seem to be so attached to the idea that you have to throw lots of resources away in grief and mourning, and literally put so many valuable goods in the ground in order to mourn the dead well. So if we just abstract from the case a little bit and think about other ways in which we might want to privilege our parents, one of them that comes up is the way Peter Singer did, which was he took good care of his mother when she was very elderly and had lots of disabilities and so on that required that she receive special care at a nursing home. Nursing homes are very expensive. By his own premises as a utilitarian, the money he was giving to his mother to take good care of her would be better spent on more basic ground level provisions for people. For example, starving people in countries that are afflicted by famine. You could use that money to save many lives and so on. And yeah, Peter Singer, of course, his whole life is in some sense invested in his utilitarianism. He's published influential articles on these issues. So he was aware of the hypocrisy, in a sense, this kind of contradiction. And as I understand it, he more or less just invoked weakness of will. He said, well, we can't all
Is that what he actually said? I couldn't remember. Okay, yeah, I wasn't sure if that was his actual response to that. But actually, someone else said, isn't that a kind of a strange response in a way? I mean, it's understandable what he did. Because his view is, if you're able to save a life, even the life of someone in a different country, and you don't do it, it's almost like not scooping a child from like a shallow pond and saving that child's life. It's
from drowning. Yeah.
And also he rejects the doing versus allowing distinction. So just allowing someone to die of starvation when you can, save that person is basically like actually killing the person. There's no real moral distinction. And so, citing weakness of will seems odd when you really do think that according to your worldview, you are also just killing these people that you could have saved by, let's say, by putting your mom into like maybe a less expensive retirement or elderly home.
Yeah. Well, despite the fact that I've heard this anecdote about Peter Singer and I've met Peter Singer, and you're right, he's very charming and
me too. Yeah, very nice person.
Yeah. So I actually don't know that much about his justification for spending so many resources on his mother. But I can say, based on what I've read by him, I can give you a kind of a template for how he'd respond, which is to say, well, he's always understood this kind of utilitarian ideal of spending your resources in the most effective way, the way that has the best consequences for people's well-being overall, as an ideal that you strive for. And just because you can't reach the perfect ideal doesn't mean that you shouldn't strive to be better. So when it comes to giving up your own luxury items so as to save famine victims that you don't know in a faraway country, admittedly, most of us won't be able to give away so many resources that we're now more or less just a modicum better off than people living in these afflicted countries. We can't reach that ideal, but that doesn't mean that we're off the hook, that you should like give up. Half measures are better than nothing, right? So giving up.
I'm pretty sure he does say that, but he does put a lot of weight on the fact that if you can save that, even that one extra child by giving up something and you don't, I mean, as I understood his view, you're morally responsible for the death of that child. And I remember reading his article and also finding it very compelling in some ways and thinking, wow, like it actually really bothered me. Wow, if he's right, then like there's blood on my hands every time I don't know, go to a movie theater. And of course, this is bound up with this classic objection to utilitarianism called the demandingness objection. And I think it comes out in these conversations about the Mohist as well.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so the demandingness objection is the gist of it is that if you are a utilitarian, according to which in everything you do, the right action is the one that would maximize well-being across the population. Some people understand it as the human population. Some people understand it as all sentient life, like Singer does. So that's a very demanding moral or ethical standard, one that we can't possibly live by. And so for some people, that already shows that this is a problematic theory. If it's so demanding, it can't be right. Other people respond, well, why is that a problem? I mean, they could still be the right ideals, even if we can't live up to them. But let's just go with this idea. I think it's a really fascinating one, Richard, that basically Peter Singer is the present day E. Jur.
That's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, so let's see what happens. And I think what I'm going to say is that, according to Mencius's response, which I'll read shortly, the problem with adopting the Singer type view, or at the very least the Mohist type view that Ijur articulates, is that you will be, in some sense, internally divided. In terms of your core moral commitments, some of them will pull you in the direction of what feels natural and right for you, what seems naturally appropriate and intuitive and something you desire to do naturally, and others will pull against the grain of nature. And so that kind of internal conflict is just the wrong way to begin developing a system of ethical values. You shouldn't have these two sources that pull against each other as grounds or foundations for your ethics. All right, so here's the passage. The two roots or two sources passage. This is Mencius 3a5. And once again, this is the Brian Van Norden translation, slightly modified. Mencius makes the following remark. I have heard that Ijur is a Mohist. In dealing with funerals, Mozi took frugality as the way. Ijur surely does not long to change the world to something that he thinks is wrong and base. Nonetheless, Ijur buried his parents lavishly, so he served his parents by means of what he demeans. Okay, I've just read Mencius's complaint that Ijur, despite his ideological commitments to frugal funerals, even for your own parents, buried his parents lavishly. So I'll continue. Mencius' student told Ijur this. Ijur said, according to the way of the Confucians, the ancients treated the people, quote, like caring for a baby, unquote. What does this mean? I take it to mean that care is without distinctions, but is bestowed beginning with one's parents. So I'll just underscore two things in what I just read. First of all, unbeknownst to some readers perhaps, Ijur is quoting a Confucian classic back at Mencius to try to justify his views. That classic is the Shangshu or the Shujing, sometimes known as the Book of Documents, where it says that ancient rulers should treat the people as they would care for a baby. So that phrase, like caring for a baby, comes from that classic. He's saying, well, as I understand this Confucian classic, by Confucians' own lights, according to their own canon, they should care for everyone like they would an infant, anyone's infant. And he says, and I take that to mean that care is without distinctions, but is bestowed beginning with one's parents. So his interpretation seems to be, you should learn to care for everyone in the same way that you learn to care for your parents. You begin to learn to care for others and love others through in this family context, but then eventually you should care for everyone ultimately in a way that is without distinctions. Okay, so I will continue reading. The student told Mencius this. Mencius said, does Ijur truly hold that one's affection for one's own nephew is like one's affection for a neighbor's baby? The passage from the documents is only using that as a metaphor. When a crawling baby is about to fall into a well, it is not the baby's fault. In other words, sages treat the people like infants only in the respect that the people need care and guidance in order to avoid hurting themselves or engaging in wrongdoing. Furthermore, heaven, in giving birth to things, causes them to have one source, but Ijur gives them two sources. Okay, so there's a lot going on there, but the main thing is Ijur has said that basically care ultimately should be without distinctions, but we make allowances for the fact that you have to learn to care for others in a family context. So presumably you start out life, if you're going to be a good person, caring with distinctions, as the Confucians would have it, caring more for your family members than you do others. But you're still ultimately aiming for impartial caring, caring without distinctions. And he's cited some Confucian text in justification of it. Mencius is disputing this interpretation of the text. According to Mencius, the best way to understand this expression, care for people like you care for a baby, is that enlightened rulers should see the people as sort of innocents who need to be guided, much as infants do, much as babies do. So it's a sort of paternalistic move. But anyway, the point is he interprets the quote differently. And furthermore, Mencius makes this claim, and this is the one we're really going to focus on, that heaven and giving birth to things causes them to have one source, but Ijur gives them two sources. So the complaint, the objection, famously abstract and somewhat ambiguous, is that Ijur struggles, his ethical worldview, his set of ethical values. They have this problem that they have two sources. And that word source is the Chinese word bun, which can also be translated as foundation or root.
Yeah, the dialectic I find to be really interesting. So I just want to clarify what's going on is Ijur is saying, well, we should begin by loving our family more, perhaps in the beginning. But really, what he's saying is that's really to develop the proper kind of concern, which, when developed, will become full-blown impartial care, or let's say equal concern for everyone. So he's saying it's not really like the idea of like caring up for your family partially isn't really in and of itself what's ultimately important. It's really kind of a stepping stone, or a part of the process by which you try to achieve what's really ideal, which is impartial care. And so I guess, well, first of all, Mencius is saying that Iger had the quoted passage from the documents wrong. It's not meant to suggest that, oh, we should really aim at, impartial care. So I think I'm clear about what's going on to that point. And then finally, we get this idea of causing us to have one source, but Iger gives them two sources. So one question is, what are the two sources? So the first source seems to be about something our natural desires or inclinations of human nature, perhaps something like that. And then the second source would be something like the doctrines or the ethical kind of ideals,
rational grounds or something,
that we've developed. That's also, I take it, Mencius thinks for Iger is independent of the first source of human nature. So, because I would imagine Mencius would be okay with certain kinds of doctrines that are still anchored in human nature. But Iger, I guess he's saying, has a certain doctrine here, impartial care, I take it, which is not anchored in human nature. It's almost like it's developed through a process of reasoning or doctrinal development. I'm not sure how he thought it came about in the first place, but through a kind of maybe mere theoretical speculation or something like that.
Yes, yeah. It's hard to say because it's so pithy, it's so laconic. I mean, it's just short little sentences that were inscribed in bamboo strips, and meant to be unpacked by a teacher and discussed in great detail and so on. So we can't know exactly how he understands the two sources, but I think you and I, Richard, like a lot of people nowadays in the 21st century, are influenced by this memorable article by David Nivison, Two Roots or One, I think is the title.
Right.
So he's the one who offers this interpretation of the two sources claim against Iger. And he says, essentially he says one source is human nature, or what's natural for us given the proclivities and temperament of the human heart. And the other source is doctrine. Doctrine translates this Chinese term yen, literally means words. And the reason Nivison comes to that view that the other source is doctrine is probably because there are other passages like 2A2, for example, where Mencius seems to be really concerned about rival philosophers who seem to think that you can arrive at the correct ethical doctrines, or yen, independently of human nature, that you don't need to take human nature into account when you come to your ethical doctrines. So what exactly does it mean to treat doctrine as a source? I don't know. I mean, basically, I think any doctrine that you arrive at without taking account of what comes naturally for you, the kind of natural development of your ethical dispositions, will count as a doctrine-based system of ethical values. So we could substitute something like, Kantianism, which is, somehow sees pure practical reason as the foundation of your doctrine. You could substitute utilitarianism, or I think certain demands that we associate with rationality, like quantifying goods and trying to find the best way to maximize goods across a whole. Those are requirements of rationality. Just any view, I guess, articulated in language according to which you can describe the values that you should strive for, and you can justify them independently of any consideration of how we are naturally, I think counts as this sort of doctrine as a competing source or competing foundation. So, just to take it out of the context of the Mencius for a little bit, sometimes Richard and I, we both teach a lot of normative ethics in our professional lives as teachers. And when we teach consequentialism and utilitarianism, we have all these sort of stock objections that often come up when you're discussing the weaknesses or shortcomings of utilitarianism, right? So one of them that we've discussed before is the organ harvesting example or the vivisection example, right? Where if you're utilitarian and you're in a position to, kidnap some healthy person and harvest their organs so as to save 5 people who have failing organs, different organs, someone's liver's failing, someone's heart is failing, someone's lungs are failing. You can take one person and harvest their organs to save the five. On a strict utilitarian calculus, it seems like you're required to do so. And so that would count, I think, as a doctrine-based view. I mean, so it would count as a doctrine-based view in Mencius's account insofar as the requirement that you harvest the organs seems not to take account whatsoever of human nature and human inclination. So I don't know about you, but I think most sort of reasonably well-adjusted human beings could never bring themselves to engage in such an act without a great deal of self-loathing or reluctance and remorse after it's over. And so it counts as a doctrine-based view insofar as it has certain moral norms or ethical norms for you that you hold yourself to, regardless of how well it accounts for natural inclination. Yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes consequentialists argue that, well, but their position is the most rationally justified, whereas other views, maybe virtue ethical views, require you to make judgments based on emotion, but emotions are a terrible guide to figuring out what to do. We have to use our reason to figure out what would be the best thing to do, which I guess for them would be maximizing the good of all, right? So I've seen these kinds of arguments. And then actually they even sometimes try to invoke cognitive psychology or brain scans to show that actually when people make choices based on consequentialism, the more of the reasoning part lights up. Have you heard?
Yeah, that's the Josh Green stuff. Yeah,
yeah,
right.
That's right. But, I was thinking of like, well, I don't know, like when like Harry Truman, dropped the atomic bombs, I think he thought, well, it would bring about the greatest good for the greatest number, right? Even though we're bombing civilian cities, and causing enormous harm to just innocent civilians.
Yeah.
But I guess he thought, and actually some historians would agree, it did stop the war early and it very well could have brought about fewer lives lost in the long run. That really could be true. But yeah, for those who hold to a certain basic moral principles, like Elizabeth Anscombe famously argued against the dropping of these bombs because she thought, no, we should always abide by a moral principle that says you can't intentionally kill innocent people.
Yeah, non-combatants.
Yeah. Even if it's for a greater good, because that's just a important basic moral principle, which is do not murder. And you can't start calculating the outcomes to justify going against that. So, it's very tricky. Yeah.
I confess I'm very torn about that particular example, using atomic bomb to prevent greater loss of life and in order to bring an early end to a terrible war. Even so, I'm sort of tempted by even by Anscombe's view that says, this was a terrible thing because so many innocent people, so many non-combatants were killed. And there's a peace activist and anti-nuclear weapons activist I met from Japan who was a survivor of the Hiroshima bombing. And he points out that the U.S. could have dropped its atomic bombs like on an empty island somewhere or something to make clear that they had this threat of force available to them without actually immediately using it to kill so many civilians. Anyway, this is a difficult issue. So if we want to make the best case for virtue ethics, at least, a kind of Confucian virtue ethics or Mencius-style virtue ethics over and against Mohist consequentialism, we can say, those are very special cases where you have what is sometimes called a tragic dilemma, where there's none of the options available to you will be without some kind of bad moral residue, without some kind of regret, warranted regret maybe. But let's leave that aside for now and talk about these other cases where, you have to choose, say, between the interests of total strangers and the interests of your family members. If you think, as the Confucians do, that in most cases you should choose your family members' interests over and against the strangers, even when there's greater good available by promoting the stranger's interests, then you can understand how there would be these situations where you shouldn't necessarily do what maximizes the good and should instead prioritize your own family members' interests more highly than you do total strangers.
Mm-hmm. Now, I'm actually, very sympathetic to this mentioned view of partial concern and love, but I wonder if we might push on a potential objection to Mencius's reliance on something like human nature or natural psychology. So you might wonder if, given that we do have all kinds of messed up, disordered, nasty desires and inclinations, because human beings, according to Kant, are crooked timbers, right? And so given that human beings do have these bad impulses and so on, why should we give so much weight and authority to human nature, this first source, we do have reason and reflection. And I suppose the Mohists or, other consequentialists and utilitarians would say, well, we've reached a moment in human culture and history where we should be promoting the best, the good, not taking into account, the natural instincts and desires that have been thrown up by, let's say, evolutionary biology. I mean, why does that have any normative significance? Besides, maybe practical realizability. So maybe that is actually going to be an important part of the argument here. But in terms of at least like a ethical significance, I guess the objection could be the authority should be placed solely on rationality or reason or maybe doctrine, I guess, rather than our natural impulses.
Yeah, right. What you're saying is like basically we should rationally derive our sort of ethical ideals and then figure out, given how human nature is, how closely we can approximate those ideals,
right?
Given our natural limitations. So human nature enters in, but only in this kind of very limited, carefully circumscribed way where it sort of identifies the starting point. But then otherwise you don't,
Yeah, so human nature is like the material that, we do have to work with. So you should pay careful attention to the properties of that material.
Yes.
Because, if it's impossible to shape it in some way, then it's not even worth thinking about. But the ideal itself, the ethical ideal, comes directly from reason, not any appeal to the nature of the material.
Yes. Okay, good. All right. So what would the Confucians say in response to that? Well, obviously, all we have really in the case of this particular passage in the Mencius 385 is the complaint that each juror takes two roots, that his ethical worldview has two sources or two roots rather than one. And he says heaven in giving birth to things gives them one root. So he just seems to take it for granted almost that if your ethical worldview or if your ethical values have two roots, one of which is not human nature, that's a non-starter. It's just not going to be viable. And the question is, why is that, And so here I can't help but draw on the later Confucians that I work on, the so-called Neo-Confucians, late imperial Confucians, like Song Dynasty and thereafter, who have this kind of view that they sometimes just take for granted also, like Mencius, but they sometimes articulate, which is that I sometimes call it a kind of wholeheartedness criterion for ethics. So this is how it goes. Basically, if you want to submit a certain ethical norm as one worth adopting, one worth sort of endorsing as one that you should strive to emulate and instantiate in your life, whether it is something like how you should behave as a doctor when doing organ transplants, or how you should behave towards your family members in family life, how you should behave towards your friends, whatever the ethical practice is, whatever the behavioral norm or practice is, if you want to actually endorse it and say it belongs to a sort of holistic picture of virtue, then it's got to be the case that it's one that you could, under certain kind of admittedly somewhat idealized circumstances, but still circumstances grounded in human nature, you could adopt wholeheartedly. If you posit that there's some ethical norm like the one that requires you to harvest the organs of an innocent person in order to save five, or one that requires you to provide food to another starving family rather than your own children and spouse, right? If you submit that those are ethical norms you should live by, and there's no world in which you could feasibly adopt those norms wholeheartedly, right? So that you're psychologically speaking entirely on board with the practice and all of your beliefs and desires push in the same direction and there's no part of you that resists, right? If it's the case that you could never adopt it wholeheartedly, then it's a non-starter in ethics. Why is that? Well, there are lots of reasons we can say. One might be that you just think that when we do ethics, we're in the business of looking for norms that we could adopt virtuously and not reluctantly. Virtuous people, generally speaking, do want to instantiate the moral practices that they endorse, right? They don't do it reluctantly. They don't hate themselves for being good people, right? Virtuous people generally are wholehearted about their virtuous activity. They're the people who go to visit the friend or family member in the hospital because they want to, not because they feel they must, or what have you. So if you adopt a kind of view that I take to be implicit in the later Confucian tradition, where the norms eligible for being ones that belong to a good system of ethics, a good system of virtues, have to be ones that you could, in some meaningful way, adopt wholeheartedly, then Mohist, e-jur style impartial caring just isn't eligible. We need norms that allow us to be partial to our own family members, our own parents, and what have you.
Yeah, so I suppose like a utilitarian like Peter Singer would say, well, ideally, if I didn't have this kind of weakness and the irrational partiality for my mom, but was fully moralized in an ideal state, I would wholeheartedly reflectively endorse, distributing all my money to maximize the good for all, right? I think he would say something like that. And I suppose, but the later Confucian response would be something like, yeah, but you can't. Is that the next part of that line? Look, you certainly didn't, but yeah, and maybe, I guess Peter Singer would say, well, that's right. Maybe given that we're human beings with this kind of psychology, our basic emotions and desires will conflict. And I guess maybe he would just end up rejecting this specific wholehearted criterion and say, but the ethical ideal doesn't require that. It just requires the rational recognition of, let's say, goodness maximization or something like that.
Yeah. Right. So, I mean, so much depends on your understanding of human psychology. But if you think that human psychology is in fact very pliant, that's, malleable, that we can reshape our desires and inclinations in pretty dramatic ways. A lot of people read the Mohists as thinking that human nature is quite malleable. A lot of people read this Confucian philosopher Xunzi suggesting that there's a great deal of room to reshape human desires and feelings and inclinations, right? So if that's your view, then maybe you could resolve the problem raised by the two sources or two roots character of Yizhi's ethics by saying, well, okay, fine. I shouldn't have two roots. I should just go with the doctrine, right? Between doctrine and human nature, just stick with doctrine. And maybe I could eventually develop my heart mind so that I'm fully on board with impartial caring, even if I'm very reluctant to endorse it, Let me just say briefly, for what it's worth, Zhu Xi, the most influential commentator on the Confucian classics, the Song Dynasty, Neo-Confucian philosopher that we talk about sometimes, he actually has, I think, a potential line of response to this view, insofar as if you read his commentary, you'll see he thinks basically Yizhi's invariably, unavoidably going to have two roots. Insofar as he resists the call of human nature, insofar as he resists the kind of deep ethical feelings that we have in our heart minds, insofar as he's trying to use doctrine or these sources that are external to our natural psychology to ground his ethical values at all, invariably there are going to be internal tensions. Why? Because he thinks that we have this kind of moral nature or inherent or original nature, which it can't be eradicated, not capable of being totally eliminated. So no matter how much you may be on board with impartial caring, there'll be parts of you that feel really awful about giving equal consideration to strangers as you do your own kids and siblings and close friends and so on. There'll be parts of you that resist, and they can't be eradicated. They can't be eliminated entirely. So anyone who has a doctrine-based view, I think Zhu Xi would say, doctrine-based account of their ethical norms, is invariably going to have two sources and not one.
Actually, I think I agree with all that. I wonder if a more conceptually significant argument is the one that goes back to, remember when you made that distinction between lifestyle and attitude? Because I was really intrigued by the attitude argument. And for the listeners, just to recall, this argument was that if you adopt something like the impartial care attitude, then really almost conceptually, you no longer have a father. So you can't really be a true son unless you have some partial special care towards your own father.
Yeah.
So I was thinking that, like, for me, it's actually a fundamental part of like a flourishing human life. It's a really necessary human good to have these special relationships. And so you need this kind of partial care to have the special relationships, which are fundamental components of a good human life. And that seems like a different kind of argument about nature of well-being and flourishing. But I guess where I disagree with Peter Singer would be in the vision of what it is to live the best human life, which I think does require something like these partial, special relationships.
Okay, that's interesting. So you're on board with Mencius and maybe with Zhu Xi's interpretation of Mencius or something. And so this then brings you to your objections to Peter Singer's utilitarianism.
Or the impartialist ideal. But maybe Peter Singer would say he's not talking about the flourishing life or anything like that at all. Maybe he would say he's talking about a very, the narrow domain of morality, And so he's just talking about what is the moral ideal. And maybe he would just say, well, he doesn't have in mind something like thinking about what it is to live the best, most flourishing human life.
Yes. Or maybe he doesn't care about wholeheartedness.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Maybe he would say, yep, that's in the domain of maybe flourishing or, living a good life. Really. And I think there's something, sorry for the listeners. I mean, this is, I think, a very difficult, challenging topic. I think there's a kind of deep divide among philosophers about the nature of ethics itself and a kind of classical versus modern way of understanding ethics and whether it's connected to flourishing or well-being or happiness, or if there's a kind of narrow domain of morality going on, which I think like Bernard Williams was really good about exploring, but also very controversial. But yeah, I guess like the way I think you and I think of ethics and morality more broadly speaking, Justin, really does also include things like this wholehearted commitment and integration of the emotions and reason and ultimately achieving human flourishing. That seems really important, I think. Whereas I wonder if sometimes certain modern ethicists, like maybe Peter Singer, are really trying to identify some kind of very much more narrow kind of a normative category that they're just talking about.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's some very deep questions here. And you're probably right, Richard, that essentially when consequentialists like Peter Singer and maybe Eger and the Mohists think about ethical norms, they're essentially thinking about some good, and they want to know how best do we bring about that good. And I guess we would sometimes say good outcomes. They're not always outcomes. Sometimes the activity is itself the end. But anyway, and then yes, you and I, having studied a lot of virtue ethics, we think of ethics not just as good outcomes, but as like a kind of package deal where it doesn't just matter what the consequence of your behavior is, but also what motivates you, how well it fits into this more holistic package of things that seem to integrate judgments, dispositions, desires, and so on that we call virtues. And so then the question is, is it possible that the two kind of theoretical approaches, people who adopt the two theoretical approaches are talking past each other? And my answer is that sometimes yes, but oftentimes no, because consequentialists and virtue ethicists at the end of the day do render what we sometimes call all things considered judgments about how you ought to behave or what you ought to do, right? And so insofar as consequentialism seems to commit people to adopting certain ways of life rather than others in virtue ethics, at least certain kinds of virtue ethics like Mencius require different ways of life, it seems like they've got to be disagreeing with each other, So, for example, we can use Wang Yaming's example when he talks about impartial caring. Wang Yaming is this Ming Dynasty Confucian philosopher, a Neo-Confucian, and he thinks of whether to feed your family in a situation where everyone is starving, where there's famine and not much food to go around. Wang Yaming doesn't quite spell it out this way, but I think he's assuming that maybe there's a case to be made for feeding a stranger's family before your own. Somehow greater good, greater benefit accrues if you feed the stranger's family than your own. And yet Wang Yaming thinks it's just not a viable option that you feed the other family. Wang Yaming is very much concerned with what I call wholeheartedness. So then the question is, well, why is that? Why is wholeheartedness that important, right? Maybe, like you say, Peter Singer and other consequentialists just think we should jettison wholeheartedness. It's like not a particularly important criterion. And here, all I can say is, well, all I can do is sort of gesture at some answers that are sort of suggested by the later Confucian philosophers that I work on. It seems to me that, among other things, there's a view that in some sense, if you don't believe that your ethical norms are ones that you could adopt wholeheartedly, then you're giving up all kinds of really important stuff. What are you giving up? Well, first of all, you're giving up what we might call a kind of rational faith in, rational hope that you could potentially become a good person. If you see your ethics as something that you're always going to have an adversarial relationship with, right, then how motivated are you really going to be to become a good person, right? So there's this passage in Mengzi 6a1 where he's debating with Gaozi, and Gaozi compares developing the virtue of righteousness to like cutting cups and bowls out of a willow tree. And Mencius thinks that's a tragedy. People will regard virtue with hostility if they think that virtues are brought about in that way, carving up their human nature, reshaping it, right? Doing damage or violence to their own nature. So that's a problem. And then the later Confucians kind of run with that idea that basically any view which undermines the reasonable or rational basis for hoping to become a good person or a sage is not a viable view.
Yeah, I think the idea is that you'll also come to resent morality. And,
Yeah.
you won't be able to think of it as part of your good. And it's almost like this alien kind of imposition, which that was a worry I had about Kantianism. I remember in college when I was learning about it, because it was appealing in a way, but then also I realized, wow, if it doesn't harmonize with human psychology, I started worrying that, it would look like some kind of alien imposition. And over time, you would come to kind of loathe it. Like it's almost like this kind of these rules, that you kind of start to hate, and that's like not even like doing you good, but somehow you got to obey. And that doesn't look like really like a viable way. I mean, sorry, maybe that probably is a terrible kind of account of Kantianism, which is much richer than, what we're saying here. But at least that's how I thought of it. I remember back in undergrad years when I first was learning this stuff.
Yeah. Well, I want to respond to you by conceding the point, Richard, that yes, we're not very charitable. So both you and I are very biased, right?
Yes.
And we haven't done justice to consequentialist views or Kantian views, for sure. But that said, if it's all right with you, I'll still finish the sort of speculative retort to your worry about this kind of fixation or obsession with wholeheartedness. So one reason we might want to sign up for the wholeheartedness criterion in ethics is because we want to have a reasonable ground or basis for the hope that we become virtuous. And we don't want to have this adversarial relationship with our ethics. We want the ethics to be something that we're quite comfortable with, at home with, even see as like something we can appreciate and celebrate or what have you, embrace. That's one reason. Another reason that comes up in the later tradition that our listeners may sort of relate to is in the later Confucian tradition, they really like this idea that when you're a virtuous person, you don't just know that your ethical norms are the right ones. You also understand for yourself that they're right. They're the ones that seem right to you. They're the ones that you understand the grounds for them, And so that's an achievement, an epistemic achievement having to do with knowledge or understanding that they call getting it oneself. And as I read them, they think you can't really get for yourself ethical norms that will always seem to you like these alien external impositions. So insofar as you value that kind of autonomy that comes to you when you fully understand in an intuitive way the ethical norms that you live by, then that's just not available to you if you're always insisting on a more Kantian or maybe more utilitarian system of values.
And it's not because they don't actually endorse their own moral or normative theory, but it's because in specific concrete human events and important, profound human moments, at least this is the argument, right? There'll be these conflicts that arise between the theory that they endorse and the other kind of moral intuitions, emotions that are still so deeply ingrained in their psychology. And so this allows the wholeheartedness, and which is, again, something that is extremely important. And so that would be the argument, right?
Yes, exactly right. So I imagine most utilitarians I know are quite good at articulating the rational basis for the utilitarianism. Most Kantians I know are also very good at articulating the rational basis for
smart people.
Yeah, right. But to endorse these systems of value abstractly isn't sufficient to achieve the kind of day-to-day, on-the-ground wholeheartedness that the Confucians have in mind. It's not enough that you understand for yourself the basis for being a utilitarian or a Kantian. The question is whether in specific decision contexts, when you're trying to decide whom to give food to in a famine situation where life and death is at stake, are you able to act on your moral convictions in a way that's wholehearted? And does it seem intuitively right to you? Do you understand the grounds and basis for it intuitively? Is it something you're fully willing to endorse? And for those sorts of purposes, at least on the Confucian view, you've got to have values that you can endorse wholeheartedly. And that's just never going to be the case for Mohism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I guess I'm very sympathetic. And again, I think we've mentioned this article a long time ago, but Michael Stocker has this famous paper called The Schizophrenia of Modern Ethical Theories. Which it's a great paper, although, I mean, people do argue against it, so that's for sure. But yeah, I think it captures some of these ideas about harmonizing oneself and aligning one's reason and emotions and the values we endorse together with our emotional attachments on lives. Yeah, I always found that to be a much more appealing, attractive kind of ideal. But I guess, yeah, maybe the serious Kantians and utilitarians will say, well, we're looking for a different ideal, right? Maybe, I mean, they do have high ethical ideals, that's for sure, right? I'm still not entirely sure. Or maybe just gesturing toward different ideals altogether that are different kinds of things, or if we are substantively disagreeing, although I think I lean toward your view, Justin, that there's some serious substantial disagreements here going on.
Yeah, right. At the very least, the rubber meets the road, as the expression goes, when it comes to like rendering specific decisions about how you should behave in specific situations. It seems like even if consequentialists and virtue ethicists are talking about different things, they still want to render these judgments about how you should live, and there'll be different judgments.
Mm-hmm. I think we're well past an hour.
Yeah, I suppose. So that was enough of a glimpse of the richness of these two arguments. They're mentioned just in passing, really, in the two passages in the Mencius, but the later commentarial tradition elaborates on them in various ways. And you can see that they're really great launching pads for interesting discussions about special relationships, consequentialism, well-being, and ethics, even nowadays, too. So we'll say that was the way for today. 感谢你的收听. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
Bye, everyone.